Hello, everyone. My name is Shamika Rhymes, and you've seen me around here on Wednesday nights with the show Celebration. So I'm so excited about today because it's been a packed day of, well, let me start here. So May is Women's Health Month. And so we are bringing awareness to women's health here at blackdoctor.org. So today has been a packed day for the Women's Health Summit. Earlier, we talked about maternal health. Then we went over to hair loss. And for this particular show, we're going to be talking about lupus. So let me tell you who's joining me today. Dr. Kimberly Trotter will be here. Dr. Kimberly Trotter is an assistant professor of medicine in the section of rheumatology at the University of Chicago. She also serves as the co-director for the lupus clinic at the University of Chicago, where she follows a large cohort of lupus patients. And also, you guys, drop in the comments where you're watching from. And as we go along, if you have questions, make sure to drop those in the comments as well, and we'll try to get to those. Dr. Trotter is also the Associate Program Director for the University of Chicago Rheumatology Fellowship Program and is a mentor to students and a trainee at all levels and trainees at all levels. Also joining me, I have Stacy J. Bell, PhD, Executive Vice President of Lupus Therapeutics. Stacy is a dynamic leader and researcher with 25 plus years of diverse experience in biotechnology, academic, nonprofit, and pharma. I cannot read today, y'all. And Stacy currently leads Lupus Therapeutics, the clinical affiliate of the Lupus Research Alliance. And welcome, Stacy. Thank you for joining me. Let's see. We also have Dr. Caroline Jeffries. She joined the Division of Rheumatology, Department of Medicine at Cedars-Sinai as an associate professor in 2015. She's also the scientific director of Center for Research in Women's Health Science at Cedars to direct the CREWHS scientific portfolio. Welcome, Dr. Jeffries. And then also joining us, we have patient and advocate, Monique Gore-Massey. Monique is a distinguished and awarded global lupus advocate, patient experience researcher. Like, y'all, I wish you could see her bio. This thing is amazing. I'm like, gosh. But Monique herself has been diagnosed with autoimmune conditions from the time she was months old. So she carries the heartbeat of the chronic illness community. And so thank you, Monique, for being here as well. So let's get started. We'll see, we're missing one, aren't we? Let's see, I guess that's it. Okay, well, so for the first question, because a lot of us are really curious about this, what is lupus and how does it specifically affect Black women differently than other groups? This question, we could start with you, Dr. Bell.
So lupus is an autoimmune disease. People ask, what does an autoimmune disease mean? And it really means, in general terms, that the body begins attacking itself. And that can happen in many different ways. And I know Dr. Jeffries will talk about this today too, how the disease is really multifaceted and really heterogeneous. So everyone living with lupus or everyone living with a type of autoimmune disease has a slightly different experience. That's what makes it very difficult to treat. And it also makes it very difficult to live with, because you never really know what you're going to expect. There's going to be trends. In thinking about lupus itself as an autoimmune disease, it predominantly impacts women. So 9 out of 10 people living with lupus are usually women, and predominantly women of color. And so when you think about treating the disease and who's living with this experience, you ask how it's affecting the Black community. Those women of color not only have a higher prevalence and presence of lupus, but a higher severity of lupus. And so when we're thinking about developing care plans, when we're thinking about studying the disease, when we're thinking about participation in clinical trials, it's imperative that we're evaluating lupus, we're describing lupus in this population.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to weigh in? Dr. Jeffries, do you want to kind of give us your thoughts on what lupus is?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally echo what Stacey said. And, I think for women of color, there's other aspects of lupus and that affect the community in different ways. And so, one thing that patients with lupus are very prone to is exposure to sunlight, and basically that can trigger flares, can trigger rashes, and can worsen the disease. And we have great products for women, for white women, to help them basically mitigate that and prevent some exposure, but also maybe to kind of yeah, well, so we're just lacking those sort of products, I think, for Black women. And also, I mean, the fact that Black women are so much more susceptible to lupus than Caucasian women is another issue. Regarding the science behind that, that's really been well worked out. I mean, there's definitely genetic aspects. So there are some genes that are associated with lupus in African American women and Asian women, Hispanic women compared to Caucasians. But that can't explain everything. So environmental exposures are another thing. Stress is emerging as a huge area of research in lupus. And so we all have different stressors in our lives, and each community has different stressors. So there are other aspects of lupus, what I call the lupus intangibles. Lupus is a disease that it's really like having the flu all. And Monique, you can attest to this, right? You feel terrible. You wake up, you're tired, you're achy. That's a good day. And you've got brain fog and all the rest of it. So, lupus is a very difficult disease to live with, apart from the fact that it can threaten organs and your kidneys, your heart, etc. It's the difficulty in living with lupus, I think. That's probably one of the hardest things for women, because you're in your childbearing years when you have lupus, when it's the most active. So that's
And
my
I think
thoughts on.
I would
Go
like
I think, Dr. Jeffries, you highlight a really important point, is that there are other autoimmune diseases where you may have this kind of impact on your body, where your immune system is somewhat attacking yourself. But within lupus, the potential for organ damage and severity, and the potential for long-term impacts, as well as life-threatening impacts, I think is something that can't be understated.
Monique, you were going to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to echo that. Well, first, let me say, for those who might be differently abled, I want to make sure we're including you in this conversation. I am a Black woman. I'm wearing glasses that are purple. My shirt is purple. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am someone who has been living with the disease going on 15 years now. There is a huge level of misdiagnosis and late-term diagnosis. And unfortunately, that's what makes it so much more potentially fatal. And I don't say that to be hyperbolic, but people are passing from this disease. And I feel like just this weekend, I was at a advocacy summit for lupus delegates. And I was just reminded, I thought I was going to meet one of my dear warriors at this summit, and she passed 3 weeks ago. You would have never known. I just saw her about 4 months ago. We had all these plans for when we were both on our feet, and you would not have known how critically ill she was and the organ damage that was happening. So I definitely would like to iterate that the living with this disease, yes, it is very cumbersome. It is very traumatic in so many different ways, but it is potentially fatal. So that is one of the reasons why we need to be very keen about what the diagnosis looks like. And the other part I wanted to, as Dr. Caroline was talking about the stressors, one thing that I realized is, as a Black individual having this lupus experience, I didn't just show up with just lupus, right? At the time of my diagnosis, I had other stressors that we mentioned. I had been in a system where I'd been dismissed, been marginalized, been minimized, been weathered, right, by a healthcare system that did not hear me. It took me about 2.5 years to get diagnosed. And unfortunately, I was not believed during that time, even though I presented all the classic symptoms of the rash, losing my hair, I was anemic, my face was swollen, I had joint pains. They said that it was due to old sports injuries. I had issues breathing, and I'm living in New York City. We would consider that the mecca of accessibility to healthcare. and it still took me 2.5 years, right? So the cohort of individuals that I represent, we don't just show up with lupus and the other autoimmune conditions. It's so much more exacerbated by the stressors and the traumas of the life that we're living in the skin of a Black woman.
Thank you for that. I am curious, since you mentioned the misdiagnosis, and I've heard stories from other women, just in other areas of my life where they have been misdiagnosed, and then eventually they do find out it's lupus. So this question is for anybody. What are some common illnesses that can be misdiagnosed as lupus?
Well, for myself, I had probably 2 pneumonia diagnoses. I was told I have a torn rotator cuff from when I played softball, so they re-diagnosed me with that. I had knee surgery years prior to playing softball and meniscus injury, so they said it's arthritic and osteoarthritis pain. I was diagnosed with pink eye, chest infections. The hair loss issue, that was something that was, let's just say this, when my hair started falling out after about 15 years of already being natural and getting this thing to a place where I knew what the heck it was I was doing with it, that's when I said, someone has to tell me what is going on, right? This is not eczema. I'd been living with eczema from the time I was a baby, so I was used to the rashes on my body. The presentation on my skin and in my scalp, that was something totally different. And also in my ears. So these, physical presentations, having high fevers, very, very severe migraines, losing my sight, not being able to walk, swollen joints, all of these things, as I later learned, were classic lupus symptoms that went misdiagnosed for about 2.5 years.
Wow. How about either of you? Are you able to speak to what are some common illnesses that could be misdiagnosed as lupus?
Caroline?
Stacey, you go ahead.
Okay. So, several things, but I think what Monique highlighted is so important because it highlights another really important element of that, and it is our healthcare system as a whole. So, when Monique goes in or someone like her goes into her primary care physician, and you're, a woman of a certain age, it's like, okay, you're fatigued. Maybe you're fatigued because you have small children or because you are athletic or, whatever that may be. And so someone in that demographic goes into a primary care doctor and they're treating the symptom. They're not thinking holistically about all these these occurrences and that medical history. So in one case, it's, oh, you have a migraine now, or, you have a rash, or, fibromyalgia, or some form of arthritis, or maybe you've been stressed recently, so that's why you're losing your hair. And unfortunately for women as a whole, I mean, if you look at the data, women are often marginalized for their symptoms, whether they consider it a psychological issue or whether they consider it a time of life issue or whatever it may be, time of the month issue. And so, many of those things are often written off in that regard. And so I think it's seeing the patient for who they are, male, female, whatever age they are. It's recognizing and trying to really listen to the individual coming forward and hearing about all the litany of things that may have occurred. But there are some, very classic symptoms of this as well. I think the other thing that's really hard are things like fatigue, because people come in and oftentimes people are diagnosed or tested for mononucleosis. They're tested for, the flu, as Caroline mentioned, and so it really is thinking overall. Oftentimes these symptoms present so severely that individuals are going into the emergency room. And one of the things that we're hoping to work on is actually healthcare provider education in the context of the emergency room, so that ER docs are thinking, okay, this potentially could be this. The other important element that I'd really like to mention, because I think it's so important, are the neurological symptoms of this. Mm-hmm. And so this disease is fraught with brain fog, as has been mentioned. Also, in many cases, depression, anxiety. I mean, I think that we were just awestruck by the article that was in the Washington Post about a woman that had been institutionalized for 20 years, for psychotic episodes and depression. And it turns out that she had lupus, so it's also, again, thinking about not only the physical presentation, but some of the psychological and neurological function elements of this. But I think that's where, for me, really thinking about, again, collaborative care and really holistically looking at the individual when they come in and they're presenting in front of a healthcare provider, really what they need to look at for that. Sadly, we don't have the diagnostic test yet, not like influenza A where you can go in and it lights up nice and bright, and, you have flu A and you need to go home and drink fluids and take Tamiflu or whatever. And in this case, it's this process of elimination. And so sadly, 2.5 years is actually pretty good compared to a lot of individuals, and that's just not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Stacey, you made some excellent points there. And I think one of them is on the diagnostics and getting us to a point where we can diagnose lupus, but all types of lupus. And that's going to be the difficulty, and in different populations as well. And, I totally agree with you about educating, the general practitioners, the primary care doctors. I had a friend of mine who had a very, very different experience. Her son was having autoimmune issues, what she thought were autoimmune issues. So she took him to the primary care doctor, and they did a blood test, and it came back with a raised ANA, which is an anti-nuclear antibody, which is something that is one of the diagnostic criteria for lupus. And the doctor just said, well, he has lupus. And without actually going to, anybody else to consult or anything like that, just said it's the opposite, completely the opposite to what we're talking about. But it speaks to the kind of myths and, misinformation that's out there about the disease, but also about, how people the diagnosis that they make, and the inability to maybe go and consult with a rheumatologist if you don't know what's going on. Because probably the best docs for actually understanding these rare sort of diseases, or anything you can't explain if you're somebody who's working on pulmonary or the heart, cardiology, you're focused on the lung, you're focused on the heart, but rheumatologists are focused on everything. So, when you're presented with something like that, I'm not a doctor, but I would think that I would reach out to rheumatology colleagues if I was. But yeah, no, we have a ways to go to basically in the diagnosis. There are some new tests out there that, really haven't proven themselves yet, because they haven't been, available to everybody. So there's some new tests that can measure cytokines, or measure a gene signature in your blood that mimics what happens when you've got the flu or a viral infection. And that's one of the things that lupus patients are presenting as if they have this viral infection, which is basically triggering their autoimmune disease. And it's probably a combination of genetics, the environment, etc., that's driving this. And we just don't know. I mean, I'm working on some proteins inside the cell that, I think are very important, and everybody else is working on their own, favorite molecule. And we're not looking at things like estrogen and how it impacts the immune system. We're not looking at melanocytes and melanin, which is the pigment in our skin, basically, or makes the pigment in your skin. We're not looking at the impact of that. So I think hormones is looking at hormones and how they're impacting lupus, and women and men in lupus is very important.
I am curious, because you guys have mentioned some of the symptoms. When you're mentioning the rash, I think that's a question that probably some of our audience is wondering too. Like, what does this rash look like? Because, y'all telling me rash, I'm like, if I had a mosquito bite, I'm like, oh gosh, is this what it looks like? Because I don't know, what does it look like? And Monique, you mentioned, in your hair or on your scalp. Like, what did those symptoms look like?
Yeah. What's interesting is, because I've been dealing with eczema for about 30 something years already at that point, it was very tricky for me to realize that this was something even more exacerbating. But what I will say is that the lupus rash, discoid rash, was thicker. If I try to pick it, and it might sound very graphic, but when we're scratching, we're itching, we pick. We're not supposed to. So I'll say that disclaimer, right, doctors? We're not supposed to. So, but I would see that it was very red, whereas with the eczema, it was like a darker, flaky kind of look to it on my skin. And also I had the butterfly rash, which went over the nose. That is my dog who's trying to get my attention, so I apologize.
That's okay.
Yeah, and I would just say that, really that characteristic butterfly shape on the face that Monique mentioned is a trigger, and also just the appearance itself. You think about thickness and discoloration, and so if you're comparing it to eczema, to psoriasis, et cetera, there is a distinctive appearance for that. But I think this highlights something extremely important, and that is what the rash looks like in various skin types.
Yes.
So if you're looking at skin types 4, 5, and 6, it's the rash appears differently and presents differently. And it also goes back to the comment that Caroline raised about sun sensitivity, and the use of sunscreen. And so there are a lot of factors with that rash that even our evaluation and clinical studies don't necessarily compensate for. And there's a lot of ongoing discussions right now about characterizing that. I'll share 2 personal experiences. So before working predominantly on lupus, I worked in psoriasis for a number of years. And even going into our website, psoriasis was always described as this red rash that was white and silver and flaky. Well, that was on someone of Caroline or my skin type, right? And I mean, even with my German descent, I'm more freckled and dark skin typed and skin toned in the summer months. But it still was something that over decades, people didn't even recognize or realize that it's like, okay, that's describing psoriasis in skin types 1 and 2. And when you get into skin types 4, 5, 6, it may be purple. It may almost be like a grayish black color, and I think that that's something that when we're talking today about women of color, Black women in particular, what do these presentations look like on their skin type? Yes. Their hair type. I mean, all these different elements that differ, that I really think have kind of befuddled diagnoses and really thinking about the disease as well. But, just going back to that for a second, when you ask even about the rash, and I'll again sharing my second personal anecdote here. So when I was young, I had eczema, and I was a child in the 70s and 80s. So at that point, slap some cream on it, and not really understanding what the mechanism was. And then as I became older, I started presenting with Raynaud's. And I started having issues with gluten sensitivity. And so I was diagnosed with celiac disease, and I have low white blood cell count. And very similar to what Monique was commenting on, there was all these factors. And even me having a doctorate in biochemistry and studying mechanistic disease, I didn't start putting the pieces together until much later. And so going in also and saying, okay, I've got these skin lesions, but I've also got these other things ongoing. And I think that when we're thinking about a rash, and if someone that's listening is presenting with a rash or they're seeing something different, think about everything else that's going on. And so when you go into your provider and say, this is something that I'd really like to have a conversation with, and this is something I'm a huge advocate for, so I'll get on my soapbox for a second, but be empowered to do that. Don't hesitate if you're brushed off or I think it's this, or we'll try this ointment or whatever else, and it's difficult to do that. I understand. But there's several resources out there to help you in those discussions, and several organizations that can provide some guidance on how to do that. And so I think with the rash in particular, going in and speaking to your primary care doctor, they may say, well, we'll send you to a dermatologist, really challenge them and say, but I also have some joint pain right now. And should I be seeing a rheumatologist or, some other specialist that may be, taking all these factors into account. So.
If I can add one thing there, Dr. Bell, you raised such a great point about that empowerment. We as Black women, we often might see our hairdresser more than we see our doctor. We might see our esthetician more than we see our doctors. So I think even this forum is great from an educational perspective, because we would like for these individuals who are in the places that we often frequent, if your hairdresser is commenting about whether it might seem like alopecia, it might seem like tension, those are things that I think are important to pay attention to. And if your esthetician or your your nail tech. You know, they're asking you about certain things. They will point it out. They'll say, tell me about this, what's going on here. Don't just brush it off. Make that a note for you to reach out to your doctor or a dermatologist. And what I have found is that oftentimes they're kind of like the first line of defense, that sometimes they may be the first ones having eyes on it before you actually get into the doctor's office. So use that as a piece of armor in your toolkit in you asking questions and further pursuing a possible diagnosis.
Thank you for that. Welcome, Dr. Trotter. We were just talking about like different symptoms and how it presents in Black women regarding lupus. Is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I just caught the tail end, but definitely I've had so many patients, tell me, oh yeah, my hairdresser has noticed, that my hair is thinning here. I've had bald spots, so that is just such great advice, and definitely something to bring up and talk with your doctor about. And I think as physicians, we also just need to be aware. I think as Stacey was mentioning, that skin rashes in particular look very different on different skin tones. And so making sure that we as physicians are all educated on how things may present differently, in certain people. So.
Thank you. So are there genetic or environmental factors that contribute to a higher incidence of lupus? I know we mentioned earlier, we kind of touched on those, that there could be some genetics or environmental factors, but what does that look like? Anybody can jump in.
That's such a great question, and it's multifaceted. Is the only way I can describe that. I mean, we are looking at genetics, environment, the impact of the environment on genetics as well. So when you experience stress, your body makes changes to your genes to basically both remember the stress, but also to respond to it. And there's evidence now in lupus that these mechanisms are altered in lupus patients, and that so your responses to environmental stressors are different, and you remember them differently. So, we think of memory from the point of view of, obviously our central memory, our brains, but also our immune system has memory. So we know that from vaccines, right? So we make our bodies remember a virus or bacteria, but we also have memory in our immune cells itself, so that they can basically, if you're stressed, your immune cells are going to rewire themselves so that they help remember the stress, respond to the stress, and in some cases inappropriately respond to stress. So I'm working on a grant at the moment, which is looking at pain. And pain is something that, in lupus patients, you can have quite a lot of non-specific pain. Fibromyalgia patients, for example, they are highly sensitive to pain. And that's both a rewiring of the brain and also a rewiring of the immune system. And you literally have to take out the environmental stressors and retrain your brain, retrain your immune system to not respond or be hypersensitive to pain. And there's a similar process going on in lupus, in that we're rewiring our immune systems so that and our immune cells, so they're always on and always attacking your body. So it's a very fertile area of research. May also help with diagnostics down the road, but it's an incredibly interesting area, but I'm not sure that helps patients right now. If it's interesting, I find it scientifically interesting. As Stacey said, I'm a biochemist as well. And I'm interested in solving the puzzle, and that's why I'm here. And lupus is one hell of a puzzle, I can tell you. As you know, Monique, as Kimberly knows, as Stacey knows.
As I'm learning.
Yeah, no, definitely, for sure. I think that the other point that you highlight, Caroline, that's very important. It is an area of research of great interest, but really everyone has an active role in that to really define, looking at the characteristics of your disease, looking at environmental factors that may have impacted your role. And that's where, organizations like the Lupus Research Alliance, which I'm fortunate to be part of on the clinical side of things. But there are a number of efforts ongoing there through our Lupus Nexus program to collect samples, to collect data and information. Other organizations have patient registries going, and thankfully there's growth in all those areas. But when we're talking about Black women, and again, women of color, it's participation in those research efforts. It's participation and willingness. And, Monique, I commend you and everyone else that I work with that shares their journey. And, I know sometimes it sounds cliche and people, say, I want to help, but truly that is the way to help, because that's the only way we learn about environmental and genetic balance within diseases like lupus. And, sharing kind of my journey, looking back, I've had several family members that, especially older family members now, that were presenting with autoimmune disease and in multiple forms. And why in some cases did a switch flip and someone now has IBD, or someone now has eczema, or someone now has lupus. And so if you look at everyone's genetic makeup, and you look at identical twins, and one has raging lupus and one doesn't, so there's definitely data and things that are indicating that it's a balance between those genetics and environment. But the only way we can learn about some of those triggers is to learn from individuals living with the disease and learn more about the disease. And so, those are the things that I think that I would encourage individuals. And we'll talk a little bit about participation in research, and particularly clinical studies. And I know, historically, look at lupus itself, 43 to 45% of those individuals impacted with lupus, especially severe lupus, are Black women, and only about 12 to 14% of those participating in clinical trials are Black women. Like, that is a huge disconnect that really needs to be changed and addressed to really help Black women living with lupus.
This question is kind of...
I'm going to echo what Stacey said. Monique, what you're doing through your advocacy is probably, it's central to helping women of color, but all women with lupus, because, trying to basically encouraging Black women to get involved in clinical trials is key to our understanding and further development of drugs.
What do you have to say to the women that are listening now that are afraid of clinical trials? Like, how do you ease their fear so that they will, say, you know what, I'm gonna try this? What can you say to them to get them to be open to it?
Kim, do you want to chime in, or do you want me to?
Sure. I think that, as you mentioned, that's definitely a huge issue that we all have to work to overcome, is getting more Black women and minorities just in general involved in trials. And I think part of it starts with having a good relationship with your care team. So, making sure that the lines of communication are open with your doctor or your other providers, your nurse, that you have a team in place. Also having like a patient partner or some type of support group. So if you're, you have a lupus support group, or you have I think Lupus Therapeutics, a PAL who has already gone through a clinical trial, those are all resources that we can use to help, introduce clinical trials, and to help, just start the conversations about, well, what is a trial? What does it involve? And how can I get involved? And just keeping really those lines of communication open, having time to talk with our patients about it. If they're interested, maybe bringing them back outside of a clinic day where you only have, you have 15, 20 minutes to talk with them, but maybe bringing them back on a separate day so you can really have these conversations, or, set up a phone call or video chat. And so those are some of the ideas and things that we're working in our clinic.
Yeah, and I think, trust is the key word there, right? So whether it be, your provider, or whether it be an association with someone individuals trust, it's also going to where they are. So maybe in certain communities, it's going to a faith-based center, it's going to a community center, even going to a hairdresser or a barber that you noted, and really say there's an opportunity, to participate in research, whether it's an interventional trial where you're actually receiving a new treatment or a medication, or even if it's just observational and sharing your experience. I think having a PAL or an advocate that you can partner with throughout that. I think the other really, really important thing is, again, going back to the empowerment. It's providing information and education to have someone be able to be confident in making their decision, what's best for them. And that really becomes, an issue of defining some of the things that may seem scary, whether it be receiving the treatment or whether the informed consent. The first time I ever started running clinical trials and I came in and I was, this excited researcher, and I gave my 35-page informed consent to the person, and they're looking at me like, what am I going to do with this? And there's all this legal language in here, and, and really being able to sit down with them. And some of it also goes to, different issue, but I came from a rural community in North Dakota. And, rural health is a big factor in this as well. And it really comes into being able to trust, who's running the trial, why they're running the trial, what's going to be the overall benefit to the community, and having, again, going back to educating and understanding that your participation could actually benefit thousands of other people. And if you talk to some individuals that have been involved in some pivotal studies for those drugs that have been approved for lupus, they've really made a difference. And I always try to emphasize to them, how their action, their choice to participate in that study, has changed the path for so many people living with lupus.
Thank you.
If I could just add one thing, this is my heart. This area of research is my heart as a patient experience researcher and a consultant, really just making sure I'm in the listening spaces with the patient and also with our industry partners. Oftentimes we talk about the historical perspective of clinical research, but we don't address the lived experience of patients today. And so we skip over that. We say, let's get them to trust us, let's educate them. But a lot of the patients still don't feel like they have the agency. They don't feel like a stakeholder in their healthcare partnership, right? Our doctors feel like they're here. The pharmaceutical companies feel like they're in another area. Everyone else feels like they have this certain level of autonomy and agency. And patients, we often don't feel that, right? So we have to make sure we equalize the playing field when it comes to education. For me, I really encourage our partners to exercise bidirectional health literacy. So it's not just incumbent upon the patients or the patient's family members and care partners to get up to speed and learn, but it's incumbent upon those who are participating and leading the trials to really share in that experience with the patients, right? It's incumbent upon them to have this union, right, of I see you, I hear you, I'm culturally appropriate, I'm culturally sensitive, I'm recognizing your entire lived experience. And oftentimes that may not be the case, but what I can say is we're moving in a better direction towards that. And I think as Dr. Stacy and Dr. Kimberly, you were also talking about that partnership. Once we really start to empower patients like myself, we give them the agency, then we can move into what does a clinical trial look like to you, right? We don't invite them into the conversation right before it goes to market. We invite them in when it's proposed, from ideation to scale. At every single point of measure, there should be a patient voice, a patient narrative. And the narrative then should be of diverse individuals, not just Black and or white, but different identities, different cultural perspectives. And that should also mirror those who are leading the trial, right? Oftentimes we go into we see the trial data and it's put together by certain individuals, maybe cisgender individuals, white male individuals. We don't see a lot of women that are the investigators. We don't see a lot of women that are the researchers. So I think that empowerment also comes from seeing those on the other end that mirror our experiences. And then the last thing I wanted to say about that is really just reminding the patients the value that they add to the process of clinical research, right? The value that's added and the value that happens even after that for their families, maybe potentially being a part of treatment, maybe receiving treatment, addressing the social determinants of health for their participation, and addressing the needs of the community partners we spoke about, right? We don't want it to be transactional. We need you to recruit, so now we're going to provide X, Y, and Z. But in addressing the needs of the community, we really get to say, hey, we're in this in the long term with you, because that's really what we hope in the healthcare ecosystem. As a patient, I want my care partner, I want my family members to feel like my doctors, the healthcare system is in it with the long run for however long it is that I'll be living with this lupus disease.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that, when I mentioned about education, Monique, it definitely has to be bidirectional. And I think the other thing that I would say too is developers, researchers, et cetera, should never underestimate a patient's capability to contribute, to learn, et cetera. I think one of the things that I'm so grateful for, and this sounds crazy to say because it was such a horrendous time, but during the pandemic, the spotlight placed on the increased health literacy that we have in our country and the ability for those individuals to advocate for themselves and to learn and to interact and engage and to contribute. And I think that that's a really important element. You also highlighted a really, really important piece that I meant to mention, and that is that individuals need to have someone that they can relate to in clinical research that looks like them, that can meet them again where they are. I was the only female in my chemistry class when I went through, and I'm not that old, right? And I cannot tell you how happy it makes me to now have our daughter in college and have advisors doing engineering and environmental research with her that are women that look like her, that have had similar experiences. And the same applies here. And it's not just the nurses, it's the doctors, it's the researchers. You mentioned the data analysts, it's the people presenting and talking about the outcomes. And so, that's where I think things like having healthcare provider directories, having research directories, having information available to individuals so they can find individuals that they can relate to have conversations about this and participate, I think is imperative to have more people involved in research.
You both could raise fabulous points that I haven't actually really considered. I mean, I've been thinking about how you could empower minorities to basically get more involved in clinical trials. But if we could change, as you said, Monique, change the structure of how we design clinical trials. And Stacey, you're in a fabulous place to kind of implement a lot of this, and you're already, this is the sort of thing you're already thinking about. We really do need to do that. We need more women at the top. We need more women involved. We need more women of color across the board involved. One thing women do better than men, obviously, is they listen. They're empathetic and they listen. But clinical trials are designed with none of that in mind. And the people that are hired to run them, unless you're working for an organization like LRA, they're going to be mostly white men and middle-aged white men, and they're not going to listen to women in the way that you both pointed out. So yeah, I think that's a fabulous point and something that I'll definitely take with me, when I'm talking to people about clinical trials. The other thing actually you both mentioned was, we need to give back too, and that's as researchers, and you mentioned it, I don't know which of you mentioned it, like don't underestimate how much, your patient can inform you about what's going on. I give a lot of talks at Lupus LA, which is a lupus advocacy group, and I give the talks to patients. And basically, you've got to explain the science of what you're doing and do it in a way that's digestible. And I get so much feedback that changes my way of thinking, because people who don't have any preconceived ideas ask the most astounding questions that actually rock your, they completely change the way you think about things. So, I think one thing, Monique, and Kimberly as well, is there's no question that's a stupid question, right? We all know that. And if we can empower our patients to ask questions, and no matter how basic they think they are, people should be allowed to ask questions and should feel comfortable to do that. That's something we've got to work on in a lot of walks of life and in a lot of areas in life. And we've got to listen to people, and politically as well as everywhere else. It's something that we just have to bite the bullet and learn.
What steps can be taken to raise awareness about lupus? I mean, this is one way, right? So, what other ways can, like, people that aren't, they don't have lupus, but they have loved ones that have lupus, and they want to raise awareness? What are some steps they can do? Monique, I'm gonna start with you.
This is such a great conversation. I'm literally trying to take notes at the same time. I feel like we can change those of us that are here. I feel like we're changing the world of lupus right now. So thank you. I actually would love for us to continue to humanize what lupus looks like and how lupus affects us. For myself, humanizing it by what is the burden that it's been on myself, my relationships, my financial status, education. It's really important to talk about all the things and facets that lupus impacts your life, and not just the physical, clinical aspects. And I think in doing so, that helps my friends and family members to understand that it's going to wax and wane from one day to the next. I help them to understand what the burden is of medication and treatment. I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, the Lupus Foundation had a statistic that the financial burden was about $21,000 a year, right? That's in addition to whatever your coverage was. Now, that was about 4 years ago. A lot has happened since then. There's a lot of medications that I'm still waiting approvals on. I get denials. So for me, it's about really trying to, as we talked about, make it very digestible, so that those who are in my community understand that maybe I am on top of the world one day, or that morning, I'll speak in real time, but about 3 hours later, I might crash, right? What does that look like when my body comes down on that crash and the rest that I need? And maybe I'm not able to drive, so I need you to help me to get to an appointment. I think we just really have to make it very digestible and humanizing the little aspects and the big aspects that it affects all the areas of our life.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that that's so true. And I've learned so much from doing panels like this and going to talks and meeting with patients outside of my office, because you get to know them in a different form. And, just, I think, as you said, humanizing it. So I feel like a lot of patients tell me, oh, my family doesn't understand because they say I look fine. It's different than other disease processes where you may, the person may look sick, in quotation marks, right? Like lupus doesn't always look like that. And you can't really, it's hard for people who've never experienced fatigue and chronic pain and, these ups and downs of lupus to really understand that. And so I think the more we talk about it, the more we explain to people, the more support that they can have from friends and family. And then I think as clinical providers also, like, we need to understand our patients outside of our office and outside of that 20 minutes. We need to also understand, them as persons, and what their support systems are like, and what other things they need from us, and how else we can best help them live well with lupus.
And I think as far as raising awareness, it's doing what Monique and so many other amazing people that I've met, it's sharing their story. It's being able to be vulnerable and honest and say, today's not a good day and this is why. And I think that goes across the board for researchers and everything else. And probably picked up from this call that I'm not a very shy person. I'm very extroverted. And my kids tease me all the time. And now they're young women, but we'll be on a flight, or we'll be, at a gathering or something, and someone will ask, what I do for a living. And I'll, launch in right away and talk to them about what lupus is and what the journey looks like. And I cannot tell you, probably 70% of the time, someone will be like, I have lupus, but I've never told anyone because I don't want my employer to know, or I don't want the person I'm dating to know, or, or someone will say, my sister had lupus and I really wish we would have known more because, she ended up perishing of kidney failure because we didn't do anything early enough, and it's things like that are heartbreaking to me, but also motivating to say, okay, people need to be in a safe space to be able to share this as well. And we as researchers, we as providers, we as advocates can do that. There are very specific ways. Get involved in your community organizations. Even if you're not in, a big area like LA where there's, Lupus LA, or, in Colorado where there's Colorado Lupus, or whatever it may be, there's a number of local things that are happening. You can reach out to the national organizations like the LRA, like the LFA, and there are a ton of activities, whether that be walks or gatherings or educational webinars, and so you can find places to plug in. If not, you can start your own. There's a someone just reached out to me this week, and there's a rock climbing event at one of the venues in Denver near where I live. And it's a family member of someone that lives with lupus, and they just decided to do this climbing event, invite all their climbing friends, but tell them about lupus, and they're raising funds, and it's going to the LRA. I mean, what a great way to be able to share that. And for those that are inclined, there's so much that can be done on the research and policy advocacy front. Again, you can plug in locally for that. You can plug in nationally for that. I know that there was just a big wave of purple that went through the Capitol, and I think that, those things, people are skeptical, what can one person do? What can a small group do? And I know firsthand by going to the Capitol myself that one person can make a huge difference, both locally, state, and federally, as far as access to medications, availability. And then the final thing, as far as just being involved in research, those that are able to share their story, they bring more people into research. Those that have been through a clinical trial and ways that they need to be supported to be able to participate in research, whether that is a ride to or that's being heard, and so there's multiple ways people can plug in to really continue to raise that awareness. But the biggest is being able to and willing to say, this is lupus. This is how lupus is for me, and this is what it means. And I think that that's going to make the biggest impact.
I think one of the things that we're fighting with in raising awareness for lupus is the fact that it affects mostly women, and that is a fact. I think the movement within that the White House has basically initiated to support women's health research and to really advocate for women's health research is fantastic. And that's going to make a big difference for lupus, because they're putting funds into not just women's health research, but specifically autoimmune disease and autoimmune diseases that affect predominantly women. So, I think we're in a good space. And it's one of the positives of COVID. COVID really highlighted the differences between men and women, both at the immune level and physiologically. And we're now all thinking about, how does this affect women differently than men? I actually have a study that's funded by the NIH to look at how women and men that suffer from lupus are different, because it is a different disease, because their immune systems and hormonal systems are different. So yeah, I'm not sure that really contributes to the
It absolutely does.
It is an extremely important point, though, because I think that if you look at how women's health sometimes is secondary in considerations, again, for funding and decision making, and even some of the things that are happening within this country right now, it's not a political issue; it's a women's health issue, and I think that that's extremely important for us, to remember. And I think that we need to advocate for those things too. So, organizations that are supporting women's health, it's that bigger picture to really say, this is impacting women. And we didn't touch on it today, and I know we're close to the end of the hour here, but I think, Caroline, you mentioned about lupus really impacting those in their childbearing years. And that's the other thing with maternal health that is extremely important in underserved communities and communities of color. And I think that's something that we can't ignore either, and that is a women's health issue overall.
Thank you for bringing that up. So I can remind everybody that, to go back and watch the video from earlier on maternal health, hair loss, and then, this one as well, play it back, share it with, people in your family, your circle, help raise awareness about lupus. I want to thank each of you for joining me here. This was a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody watching has learned a lot as well. Thank you so much.
Shamika, can we put one final plug in with raising awareness? In addition to it being Women's Health Month, it is Lupus Awareness Month. So everyone, wear your purple, let people know, post on social if that's your thing.
Yes, hashtag Lupus Awareness Month. Thank you for that reminder. All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. And again, you can always head to blackdoctor.org to find any articles and stories on lupus, as well as Women's Health Month. And I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you all.